So this is the beginning of part 2 of proxies, a continuation of the first video. Just due to the limitations of the length of video, I had to break it into 2 parts, otherwise YouTube wouldn't support it. So part 1 can be found on the same channel, Loopline Scrapebox on YouTube. So public or private, free or paid? I hear this all the time. Really what this boils down to is public proxies are the ones we were harvesting there from forums or through Scrapebox. Private proxies most generally are, simply are a proxy that's not shared with the rest of the world. So maybe you have a proxy server in your basement that you set up, or a friend sets one up, or you have access to one for your work, or you find a proxy server that's not public that requires a username and password, or you buy proxy servers, which is most commonly the case in the world of Scrapebox, if you will. So then that enters the question, free or paid? Well, I think both have their uses. The free proxies you can get from forums, you can get from Scrapebox. You can use those, but when you go to post to blogs, for instance, you don't know that other people aren't using those. And so if other people are using them and they're making stupid comments and they're getting spam filter banned, then you're automatically going to get spam filter banned as well, just because you're using the same IP address. So free proxies are most generally used for things like checking PageRank or harvesting URLs or various other things. Generally speaking, if you want to post, it's generally better to use a private proxy, whether that be paid or you happen to come across one free from a friend or whatever, but most generally paid. And you're going to get a lot faster response rate. My speeds on my private proxies are just as good as my IP speed for all intents and purposes when it comes to Scrapebox. And it's going to be a good quality connection with a low latency. So really a paid proxy here for some things, even PageRank checking. Like when I use free proxies for PageRank checking, depending on what PageRank server you're hitting, you're going to get different results. And believe it or not, it can vary phenomenally. So I can run the same list of URLs through private proxies, and one time a page can come up as PageRank 6 and the next time it might come up as PageRank 0 or not applicable. Whereas when I use my paid proxies, which are all US based, as is my own IP, then I always get consistent results. They match my IP and it's true PageRank, and so I only use private paid proxies for checking PageRank, and I use them if I wanted to make a very small URL harvest very quickly. If I'm testing things or when I'm commenting specifically is when I use paid proxies. So here's a little tip. This is what I do. This is a guideline. This is definitely not a rule. You can do whatever you like, but basically what's happening is when you have a number of proxies, let's say you have 500 proxies, and you go out there and you say, all right, Google, I want URLs, and you start harvesting URLs, and you set it to 500 connections. Well, you're constantly always using a proxy to pull from Google, and they're going to very quickly see, all right, you're pulling proxies, you're pulling too many results too quickly, let's shut you down. So they ban the IP, and then you can't harvest anymore. Well, if you reduce that, I use 20%. So if I have 500 proxies, I set my connections to 100 or less. So that way, there's always 4 proxies not being used, basically, or 80%. And so it's a constant rotation. So if I use proxy 1 to pull a URL from Google, then it's going to go to proxy 2, 3, 4, and 5, and by the time it gets back around to 1, there's been enough of a time lapse where Google isn't going to trigger the filter and ban that IP address quite as quickly. By setting a 20% ratio, if I have 100 proxies, I set my connections to 20. So by setting a 20% ratio, I'm able to scrape 10 million plus URLs by throwing in 400 or 500 good proxies and just let it run for a day or two straight. And it'll scrape millions of URLs and they don't get banned. Same thing with PageRank. If I have 10 private proxies checking PageRank and I set my PageRank connections to 10, it's going to always be using those proxies and they get banned quickly. Whereas when I set them to 20%, so if I had 10, I'd set it to only 2, it's a little slow, but it's private proxies, so it actually goes pretty fast and I can run through 100,000 URLs. Now you probably, when you're getting to massive numbers, want more than 2 proxies running more than 10 private proxies anyways, but my rule, my guideline I use is 20%, and I found it works really well. So, error codes and timeouts. Error codes with a proxy are basically the same thing. If you get a 404 error code with your proxy, it's the same thing as if you get a 404 error code with your own IP. The page isn't there. It can't find it, one way or the other. So error codes are pretty straightforward. Timeouts, you really need to understand what a timeout is. I see so many people that just don't understand how Scrapebox works. And so the short of it is that Scrapebox is going to emulate Internet Explorer. And basically, if you try to load a page up in Internet Explorer, and the page is massive, have tons of pictures on it, tons of content, and all that sort of stuff, and it takes forever to load, Scrapebox does the same thing. So if I'm trying to, say, comment on a site, and I'm using fast poster or slow poster, either one, and I want to pull up this web page, if I set the timeout to like 10 seconds, Scrapebox is going to wait 10 seconds. If the page hasn't loaded, then it's just going to move on to the next page. So same thing with the link checker and the rest. If I set my timeouts too low, when it tries to check for links, even if my link is on the page, if it hasn't finished loading the page yet, it's still going to just go ahead and move to the next page. So you have to be very careful, and you need to test all your different functions with timeouts and see what works best. For instance, when I do a very large number of connections on my link checker, I max the timeout out to 90 seconds. Because if I'm running, say, for instance, 100 connections, and it's trying to load 100 pages at once, this is especially dependent on your internet connection. If it only loads the first 50 inside of the timeout window, if you set it too low, like say you set it for 20 seconds, it's only going to load the first 50 pages in the first 20 seconds. This is going to skip all the next 50 pages. You might have had 50 links there that's going to skip and you didn't know you had, which is going to totally skew your results if you're testing. So it's very important that you understand how timeouts work. Timeouts apply to everything, more or less, when it comes to posting or when it comes to link checking. It also can apply to the various add-ons. Like say I wanted to do the blog analyzer add-on. Whenever I'm in there, it doesn't give me a timeout setting there, but it gives me a number of connections. So this is directly dependent on your internet connection speed. But if I'm running like a 1 megabit internet connection and I try to set my connections to 100 on Blog Analyzer, then it's going to try to load 100 pages at once. Well, a 1 megabit internet connection is not going to support that, so it has a pre-established timeout that you can't change in there. So it's just going to say error timeout, and it's going to move on. So in order, if you're seeing error timeout a lot, you either need to raise your timeouts settings in the settings. So if we go in here to settings and adjust timeout settings, there's a whole category for this. This is obviously important. I can adjust all my timeout settings, and I move these around, so these aren't necessarily what I use, but say my link checker, I got it maxed out to 90. If I run this bad boy down to 10, I'm gonna miss out on all kinds of pages. So adjust your timeout settings. If you're doing anything like link checking or the slow poster, the fast poster, proxy harvester, and you get timeout errors, play with your timeouts. Turn them up, see what happens. Turn your connections down. Your timeouts and your connections are directly related. If you're turning your timeouts up, you might also need to turn your connections down. This applies to add-ons, it applies to everything. And anything where there is an add-on, say, and I want to use the blog analyzer add-on, and I don't have a fast enough internet connection to support it, then you got to turn the connections down. So if I pull a blog analyzer and I ramp the connections up to 250, it probably can't load 250 pages, depending on my machine speed, my processor, my RAM, and then that internet connection. Just try to turn your connections down. Try to slow down a little bit if you're having timeout errors. Some pages are going to time out. It's going to happen. It just happens because the web server might not even be there. It might not be up when you're trying to pull it. But if you're having really bad issues with timeouts, turn your connections down, turn your timeouts up. Okay, I'll get off that hobby horse. And that is the end of proxies in the video.